Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and on this video, we're going to take a look at Africa and world trade. This is Chapter 25, Part 2, Africa and World Trade. As a reminder that Africa has long been involved in world trade, and this period was in many ways a continuation. So by the end of this video, you should be able to answer the two following essential questions. One, how did trade networks of Africa both experience change and continuity during this time? And two, how did Europeans integrate themselves into existing trade networks within Africa, networks of trade and exchange within Africa? Let's have a look. So let's start with the legendary Trans-Saharan trade. So it's worth noting that normally when people talk about the Trans-Saharan trade, it's usually after Prince Henry sails down the coast of West Africa. People tend to sort of write it out of the history books because, look, you can sail around it. Why in the world do you need to walk across the desert where you can just sail? But even though that would seem intuitive, it actually isn't the case. Up until the 1600s, almost half of Europe's gold probably came from south of the Sahara, the Americas notwithstanding. But salt and gold continued to be traded in very large amounts. The city of Timbuktu continued to be a very large city. Into the 1550s, people continued to describe its richness, its vibrancy. And so even though, again, it would seem like the discovery of a sea route around the Sahara would sort of cause it to go into decline, that does not seem to be the case. And it's worth remembering that, 100 years after the voyages of Columbus, the sultans of Morocco are off waging war to take control of the salt fields of the Sahara. That's how valuable this trade still is. And it's worth noting that the House of City-States that we talked a little bit about back in units 1 and 2, that were kind of the end of the Trans-Saharan trade routes, a lot of them continued to exist into the early 1800s just on the trade that they were doing on the Trans-Saharan trade route before falling victim to French and British imperialism. On the other side of Africa, the Indian Ocean trade continued to play a role. Swahili coast navigators continued to serve the Portuguese trading post empire as pilots, as navigators, as intermediaries. Even though they were controlled by Portugal, that didn't necessarily mean that the Portuguese were in total control of everything there. And what's really interesting is the fact that cowrie shells, which is these little shells that were historically used as currency throughout the Indian Ocean trade system, continued to be used as a form of currency. So even after the Portuguese have taken control and established their cartaz, these cowrie shells are still being found all over the Indian Ocean trade basin, which is proof that some things continue to last even if the political situation changes. Cowrie shells would continue to be used as currency up until the mid-1800s when imperial powers, particularly Britain and Germany, would sort of remove them from circulation by force and force the monetization of their colonies. So Africans also continue to take role as mercenaries and sailors in the Portuguese Empire. There is the famous case of Yasuke, who was an African who was a servant to several Portuguese Jesuits as a bodyguard, and later on became a samurai that served under Oda Nobunaga and witnessed the unification of Japan. So Africans continued to play a role in these trade networks far and beyond just the borders of Africa itself. There's actually been recently a very interesting book written about Yasuke, the legendary African samurai. I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're curious to learn more. Back kind of over to West Africa, we have the Atlantic trade, which, as I said, became much more popular after the Portuguese managed to demonstrate one could, in fact, sail all the way around Africa. And so after 1450, European nations, all the European nations, not just Portugal, we've got France and Sweden and Denmark and the Dutch, like everybody set up a fort. We established what they call forts and factories. Now we think of a factory as a place where you build stuff, but back then a factory was a place where a factor lived, and a factor was just a businessman. So it was a fort and a place where a businessman would live, and these businessmen would do negotiations with the local rulers on the coast to get their slaves or whatever it was that they were purchasing. Goree Island is a very famous one. It's actually been featured on many like little documentary series where people try to go, descendants of African slaves try to go back to Africa and find out where their ancestors came from. A number of them have ended up on Goree Island, because it was a major slaving port, and so it had a long history. It had changed hands many times as Europeans fought each other and fought wars. So Goree Island is an excellent example of a fort and a factory. And it's also worth noting that this trade was largely conducted on equal terms. I mentioned in the last history bite that Europeans often didn't just go in seeking to kidnap slaves or to plunder villages. They oftentimes had to negotiate because there were established powers. And Europeans also weren't immune to diseases like malaria that would kill them pretty quickly. And so one of the ways that some Europeans sought to kind of negotiate with these established powers was by marrying into the local elite. And so signores was the term for wealthy African women, sometimes mixed African and European women, who tended to work with European males. The Europeans would gain an insight into the market economy of wherever they were by marrying these women and get their knowledge, and the women themselves would gain a certain amount of status boost by marrying a European merchant. So you have these unions of African wealthy female African merchants and wealthy European male merchants. So both sides would gain something. One would have access to larger resources, and one would have access to a larger market. On the Atlantic trade, although we oftentimes think of it as a predominantly slave trade, there actually were a lot of other things traded. Cloth textiles, African-produced iron, believe it or not, Africa. You might remember all the way from pre-Unit 1, we talked about the Bantu being some of the earliest iron workers in history. Africa continued to produce as much, if not more, iron than Europe did at the time of 1450 to 1750. Also, gold continued to be an export. Firearms were very popular in Africa. Some African kingdoms even were starting to learn how to make their own cannons in West Africa. And of course, slaves, there's no really getting around that. But it is important to note the slaves were far from the only thing that was traded along the Atlantic coast. So here's a picture of sort of the many networks, the many ways on the Trans-Saharan trade route. And this is a painting of a señores, one of those wealthy female merchants, and her slaves. Many of these women were so rich they had their own slaves. So you may have heard the term triangle trade. It describes a three-way trade, usually between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. In U.S. history textbooks, sometimes it's described as the 13 colonies, Europe and Africa, but we take a slightly wider view here. And in this case, it sort of follows a standard pattern, if you will. The idea is that slaves are sent from Africa to the Americas, who then extract raw materials that are sent to Europe, who manufacture those materials into goods that they then sell down to Africa to buy for slaves. And so the triangle goes on and on. However, while there's some truth to this, it's vastly oversimplified. The historian John Thornton has pointed out that most of the goods that were traded in this supposed triangle trade actually came from outside of it. So in particular, silk and cotton textiles from South Asia, aka like India, being brought to West Africa by the Dutch and English East India companies was actually one of the most demanded goods in West Africa. And perhaps Thornton estimates European manufactured goods like furniture, iron, or guns may have made up only like 20% of the trade at most, according to his estimates. So what John Ecott, who wrote a book called Selling Empire, describes this trade as actually more of a bow tie trade, or two separate triangles, which you can kind of see here. The idea being that, yes, there's the standard triangle we always imagine, right? But then there is the additional triangle, right, which takes into account Southern Africa as well as South Asia to kind of complete. And so it looks a little bit like a bow tie if the little tie was in the center, and these are the two ends of the bow. So it's a much more broad definition of trade in the Atlantic world than we normally take into account. And so the Atlantic trade is probably the most impactful of all the trades we've just talked about, mainly because it starts to become the most the one that has the highest volume and movement in goods and people become involved. One of the most obvious implications is the increasing influence of Christianity, and we see this in the form of Dona Beatriz, also known as Quimpa Vida, who is a woman who lived in the Kingdom of Congo, and she begins to have visions and sees herself as a reincarnated version of Saint Anthony that launches an Antonianism movement, which seeks a purer, more devout form of Christianity within the Kingdom of Congo. So an indigenous African Christian movement that is eventually suppressed by the King of Congo with the encouragement of the Portuguese, who see it as a heresy. And although Christianity did gain a lot of ground, it is really worth noting that both Christianity and Islam together still did not account for the majority of believers on the continent, and that shamanism and kinship ties continued to be the dominant religion across most of Africa at this time. We also see a small change in gender dynamics in parts of West Africa as a consequence of the slave trade. Several observers visiting the region noted that there was a rise in polygamy because of the shortage of male individuals because of the slave trade and the conflicts that spawned it. We also saw some small-scale population growth because of the introduction of American crops such as maize and sweet potato, which entered the diets of Africans. Now, we often talk about European population growth exploding because of maize and the potato, but this occurred also in parts of West Africa, and maize and sweet potato have become an essential part of the West African diet, in addition to West Africans sending things like manioc over to the Americas, along with some other vegetables. There's also something you might have heard of called the gun-slave cycle hypothesis, and the idea is that the desire to purchase slaves led Europeans to sell guns to African rulers, who then used those guns to get more slaves, and then the people that they attacked would buy guns to defend themselves. And so an arms race essentially ensued, in which everybody bought guns to get slaves, to get guns to get slaves, and so on and so forth, which intensified the cycle of violence. Now, this is somewhat disputed by historians. So, for example, John Thornton says that the gun-slave cycle wasn't really that big of a deal, and he points to the fact that many states continued to rely on horses and archers, not primarily guns, whereas Walter Rodney, who wrote the book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, points to data that shows an increase in the sales, in the shipments of guns from Europe to Africa at this time. New data that kind of brings these two views together suggests that indeed there was a gun-slave cycle, but it really only occurred at the most intense part of the trade, which was after 1750. And so if we take a look at this table right here, we can see that actually for a really long time, the trade was relatively minor. Only even by the end of the 1600s, there were not even 1 million slaves being taken out every 25 years. But when you get over to 1750, suddenly you're talking about a couple million slaves every 25 years. So you can see it just sort of takes a jump in the 1700s, and scholars see if the gun slave cycle was a thing, it was definitely a thing around this time. And so this is data on the slaves imported into the Americas. It's worth noting that the slave trade was officially outlawed by Great Britain in 1807, so like around here. But notice that we still have another 50 years of massive exporting of slaves every single year. So it's interesting, we talk about like the end of the slave trade in 1807, but the data seems to indicate that there was still plenty of slave trading going on, even after the end of the slave trade. So anyways, I want to thank you for joining me on The Spite of History. You should be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the video. I'm Mr. Little. I hope that you have learned something, and I will see you next time.